The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Over the past 15 years, Islamophobia in Western societies with minority Muslim populations has been well documented. But Muslim-majority societies have not been so extensively studied as flashpoints of Islamophobia. Pakistan is one such society. The country's former Prime Minister, Imran Khan, drew attention to the rising tide of Islamophobia in the world, calling for greater respect for religious symbols and practices, and restraints on hate speech and discrimination against Muslims. To discuss these and related issues, please join our live panel of experts, bringing your questions, comments and challenges. The event will broadcast live of all social media platforms of the Democracy Forum.
Hello and welcome to this Democracy Forum debate on a complex, sensitive and emotive issue, making sense of Pakistan's Islamophobia syndrome. I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host with a panel of experts who will talk us through this cultural, political and too often violent labyrinth, which pits one religion against another and too often sects within Islam against each other too. And so much in recent decades has focused on the changing face of Pakistan, so geostrategically pivotal, yet from the eyes of Washington at least, so unreliable. To debate and discuss, we have Pervez Hoodbhoy, Kunwar, Khuldune, Shahid, Jocelyne, Cesari and Farid Ahmed. Summing up will be Democracy Forum President Barry Gardiner, MP, a veteran politician of world crises who through his constituents has lived on the front line of the war on terror and its consequences. And to lay out the canvas of our discussions, we welcome, as always, the astute words of the Democracy Forum President, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, which has been convened to consider the contradictory attitudes to Islamophobia, which have come to define the state of Pakistan. Those of you who follow our proceedings will be aware that this is an issue which is regularly addressed by the Forum and by our sister publication, Asian Affairs Magazine. And I'm grateful to the team at TDF for organizing this event and for inviting such an eminent panel of speakers to participate. And I'd like to thank Humphrey Hawksley, as always, for agreeing to chair this session today. In his first speech to the United Nations General Assembly in September 2019, as Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan claimed that the emergence of radical Islam and Islamophobia is entirely a consequence of Western and liberal ideology, prompted by the publication of the Satanic Verses by the Indian writer Salman Rushdie in 1988, Imran Khan explained that Islamophobia grew in momentum in the aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center, when Western politicians began to equate radical Islam with terrorism. and where Islamic communities in Europe began to be deliberately marginalized, leading to the radicalization of young Muslim men. Conversely, Khan emphasized that Islamic states, such as Pakistan, have inherited the mantle of a classical and ideologically tolerant Islam from 14th century Medina, where everyone was free to practice his religion and where there was a sacred duty to protect all places of religion, he continued in his speech, and where every person was equal in front of the law, whatever his religion. In claiming the sanctity of religious tolerance in Pakistan, Khan was following the line taken by former leaders of his country, starting with the inaugural speech given by Muhammad Jinnah almost 75 years ago to the Constituent Assembly on the 11th of August, 1947. "You are free," Jinnah said. "You are free to go to your temples. You are free to go to your mosques or to another place of worship in this state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed that has nothing to do with the business of the state." So it's an unfortunate historical fact that however the founding principles of theological tolerance and religious pluralism, which Jinnah had expressed so eloquently, have never been given a chance to take root in Pakistan, and that intolerance has been pursued by the state in a deliberately divisive way, with the intention of undermining the security of sub-state and minority groups. The historian Sumit Ganguly concludes the periodic rise of violent sectarian movements in Pakistan reflect the failure of the state to recognize and accept the presence of cultural and religious pluralism. Despite the celebratory program last year to mark the 75th anniversary of the foundation of Pakistan as an independent state, it's an uncomfortable fact that the intolerance of minority Muslim groups has continued unabated for almost as long. Christine Fair, who regularly speaks at our forum events, is unequivocal in her attribution of the constitutional amendments of 1949 to validate the institutional intolerance which has followed ever since. Pakistan's leadership has consistently pursued Islam as a national ideology, she writes. With the passage of the Objectives Resolution in 1949, religious entrepreneurs and ulema assumed a permanent role in deciding who is a Muslim and who is Muslim enough. The leading historians of the evolution of South Asian states post-independence have concluded that Islam has failed to provide the glue that can hold Pakistan together. Indeed, Pakistan's contorted constitutional evolution has both exacerbated and enabled a constant state of fratricidal and internecine violence between Muslim communities divided by geography and ideology. It's incontrovertible that persecution of the Ahmadiyya sect started over 70 years ago and still continues today. The 1971 civil war between East and West Pakistan, which the Forum acknowledged last year in a dedicated webinar and publication, reflected the bitterness engendered by differences in cultural and linguistic identities within and between Islamic communities. Sectarian conflict between different Muslim sects has been instrumentalized by the Pakistan state, thus exacerbating Shia-Sunni differences, acquiring a greater salience as a consequence of both domestic and international politics. The migration of Muhajir Muslims into Sindh following partition in 1947 created resentment among ethnic Sindhis and encouraged a push for provincial autonomy, resulting in the protests of 1968 and in 1977, and contributed to the rise of Islamicist militancy in Karachi by weaponizing the Muttahide Qawmi movement. And furthermore, sub-state nationalism has continued to plague relations between the Pakistan government and its peripheral regions of Balochistan and the northwest frontier province. While the strategic imperative of retaining a territorial interest in Jammu and Kashmir condemns India and Pakistan never to find a solution to this conflict. As a former Prime Minister, Ali Bhutto remarked prophetically, "If a Muslim majority can remain part of India, then the raison d'etre of Pakistan collapses. Pakistan is incomplete without Jammu and Kashmir, both territorially and ideologically." Addressing Arab leaders in Cairo in 1946, Muhammad al-Jinnah told his skeptical audience that it is only when Pakistan is established that Indian and Egyptian Muslims will be really free. But Jinnah had not anticipated the creation of a fundamental dichotomy which lies at the base of Pakistan's statehood, which sustains its political instability, justifies the dominance of its military interests, stifles the growth of its democratic institutions, and which ensures, for the foreseeable future, Pakistan's nationalist enterprise will remain subject to intense sub-state, nationalist, regional, sectarian, and ethnic contestation. There is much for our panelists to discuss today. Please feel free to pass your questions and comments through the chair, and they will be passed on to the panelists.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. As you said, much food for thought. An uncomfortable fact that the intolerance of minority Muslim groups has continued unabated for almost as long. Islam has failed to provide the glue that can hold together Pakistan. Yes, please do comment, question, challenge what our panelists say. We have some questions in which I will be posting up on the screen as we go through. When people saw or the audience saw the title and the subject matter we were debating today. Our first panelist is Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, a nuclear physicist, a career in academia at the top American and Pakistani universities. He's the author of Islam and Science, Religious Orthodoxy and the Battle for Rationality, and a former member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament. Dr. Hoodbhoy will help us define Islamophobia and put Pakistan in perspective with other Muslim countries. Pervez Hoodbhoy, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I did hear the comments by Lord Bruce about Imran Khan, and certainly I shall come back to them. I will have to, in fact, because out on the streets over here in Islamabad, there is complete silence. Today, there is a massive march to the capital, and Imran Khan has called for a shutdown of the country. Let me begin by separating Islamophobia from Muslim phobia. These are two completely different things. Muslims can be discriminated against, they can be mistreated, they can be killed, but that will not raise resentment to the level as when Islam is itself targeted, because Islam is supposed to be perfect, whereas Muslims who may be the living embodiment of Islam or reflect some of its teachings can be imperfect. And so the level of resentment that one sees when Muslims are targeted is very different from when Prophet Muhammad is targeted, as for example in the Charlie Hebdo case, the caricatures of the Prophet and so forth. And so this is something that is true across the board, across Muslims living in Pakistan, in Europe, or the United States, or wherever. However, there is something very particular to Pakistan, and this is something that I will focus upon. One does not hear of riots in Tehran, or in Riyadh, or in Jakarta, or elsewhere, when such provocations happen. And frankly, they are provocations because those who made the cartoons or those who deliberately provoke Muslims know that they are provocations and yet do them. But the reaction is entirely different in the cities of Pakistan, where very easily mass rioting can happen, there can be blood on the streets, where the institutions of state are also targeted, where the police is actually itself a target of rioters. So the question is, why is Pakistan different in this regard? Of course, there are expressions of protest by Muslims elsewhere in the world when such instances happen, but they go to the very extreme when such a thing is noticed in Pakistan. And the question is, why? To my mind, it happens because in Pakistan there has been a systematic use of religion to achieve legitimacy. Legitimacy for political power and for individual acceptance into society. And so the consequence of that has been a seepage of religious indoctrination into the education system, and it has led to a very charged populace, one that will then react very readily to the slogan that Islam is in danger or Islam has been insulted, and so it will respond in a manner which is qualitatively different as compared to elsewhere in the world. Now let's return to the specific situation in Pakistan. It is true that Pakistan was formed on the basis of a religious identity, that Muslims and Hindus were the two major components of Indian society, and in fact Mr. Jinnah stressed that the two cannot live together in peace. But after the formation of Pakistan in 1947, there was not that kind of religious tension that exists today. In my early years growing up in Karachi, we had neighbors who were Christian, Sikh, Hindu, Parsi, Zoroastrian I mean, and there certainly in my school there were kids from all religions, mostly Muslim, but all other religions as well, including, I well remember, a Jew. But that has changed, and it has changed because the Pakistani state has sought to establish its legitimacy on the basis of religion. It could have done otherwise, but it chose not to, or perhaps felt it had to in order to keep Pakistan together. I personally believe that that is not necessary, but one must go by what history has told us. And in particular, after General Ziaul Haq, who usurped power in 1977 and then absolutely changed the character of the country, it has been very difficult to get off that track. And so the use of religion, of Islam in Pakistan, has now become elevated to the point where it has become virtually impossible to act against those forces which claim to be Islamic forces. Now, it so happened that the state, well, in 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Thereafter, a great global jihad was organized by the United States, by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And that fundamentally changed the character of the country, because the Pakistani state had to then, well, it didn't have to, but it chose to recruit soldiers for Islam from the madrasas. The madrasas exploded in numbers, and now the kind of teaching that happens in Pakistani schools is reflective of pretty much what is taught in madrasas. So the national curriculum defined by Imran Khan, the so-called single national curriculum, is in fact very close to what is there in the madrasas. And that has led to the elevation of religion as the major force in Pakistani politics. Here I will fault two particular leaders. One is General Ziaul Haq and the other is Imran Khan for increasing the quantum of religious education and of infusing more religion into the body politic. Ziaul Haq is long time gone, but Khan, during his three and a half years in politics, made a very concerted, systematic attempt to do what he could to drive Pakistan towards more religion. And you can see that in a number of ways. You can see it in his creation of what is called the Rahmatul Alameen authority, that is to say the authority of the Prophet, which then would which would then monitor the moral standards of the Pakistani public. He went out of his way to appeal to the international community that Islamophobia would not be tolerated and that there should be special laws against that. At the same time, he made no attempt to condemn the killings within Pakistan of those people who belong to a different sect of Islam, meaning those who were not Sunnis. So the Shia Hazaras who have been targeted because of a different religion, because of a different sect, I should say, and because they're different in appearance, there have been hundreds of such killings, thousands maybe, a couple of thousands, and this is not too far back in the past, in spite of the fact that these killings were claimed by the Islamic State, Daesh as it's called over here. Imran Khan made no expression of sympathy for them. In fact, when minors in Balochistan had been killed by the Islamic State, Imran Khan made it a point to say that he would not go and meet them because this was part of a conspiracy. He would also not criticize any other killings of Muslims, or in particular those of Ahmadis. So his claim that Islamophobia is his claim that minorities are protected in Pakistan, I'm afraid are not credible. The non-Muslims, Hindus in particular, have been not allowed to make temples. The discrimination against them continues in every sphere of life. And in fact, there is no law which protects young Hindu girls from being abducted and being married off and converted into Islam and so forth. So in this sense, Pakistan is different, because in seeking to achieve legitimacy for its political system and its political class, it has turned more and more towards Islam. However, the contradictions of this are being apparent. So when the TLP, which is an extreme Barelvi group of Muslims, and within Sunni Islam there are the Deobandis and the Barelvis, when they demanded the expulsion of the French ambassador from Islamabad, Imran Khan agreed to negotiate with them. However, when he did enter into negotiations with them, they turned out to want to take over. And at that time, the police confronted them, in response to which the rioters committed bloody murder, and they killed well over 12 policemen. However, under a deal, there was no punishment for them. But this reminds us that using religion in matters of the state and mobilizing religious mobs is then a prescription for disaster. So I am very afraid that now that Imran Khan is again seeking to come back to power and is using the symbols of religion as well as of a Western conspiracy against him, that our future here in Pakistan is very much in the clouds. We don't know. We are, and when I say we, I would say it's across the board. The level of tension in Pakistan today is unprecedented. We are seeing even the army being split into pro and anti-Imran Khan supporters, and this is telling us that the exploitation of religion and the use of xenophobic sentiment can be very, very dangerous. I hope that this will be a lesson not just to Pakistanis, but also to other peoples in the world, and in particular to India as well, where anti-Muslim sentiment and the attempt to create a Hindu state can be very dangerous for India. Thank you. I'll stop over here.
Pervez, thank you very much for that. Could I just clarify for the purpose of our debate? So when we talk about Islamophobia, you mentioned Charlie Hebdo and war on terror and that sort of thing. Are we talking about two types? There's other religions against Islam, as we saw in the Charlie Hebdo thing, but then there's the internal friction within Islam itself, the Sunni against Shia, and that you said. Could you just give us an analysis of how all that weighs up?
Well, as you know, that the split within Muslims happened almost immediately after the death of the Prophet, and so this is a 14 centuries old dispute, and it's never going to get resolved. There have always been bloody fights between Shia and Sunni, but they have been less at times and more at other times. Within Sunnis, there are very many sects, and these sects are separated according to the 4 schools of Islamic law. Again, these have not been friendly to each other. These have had bloody fights. But looking at the history of Islam, one sees that these have been more at some times and less at other times. When there have been strong rulers in power, then religious frictions have been lessened, and one sees this in the case of, let's say, Iran today and of Saudi Arabia. You do not hear of religious riots within either of these two countries because they have they're not democracies, but they have governments which are totally in control. In Pakistan, that is not the case. Here, there's a government that is much weaker in a sense, and incapable of controlling the various religious divisions within the society itself. Okay, and so you see, well...
Right. So we've got two elements that can all be leveraged or exploited politically. We've got the friction within Islam and the friction between the religions. Can you, before I let you go, give you a question from Nazir Khan here, which is under Imran Khan, China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims was not condemned by Pakistan, and his government even actively enabled it. Was Khan therefore the problem regarding Islamophobia rather than the solution? Quick answer to that?
This reflects his pragmatism. He says, I don't even know what's happening in China. How can I? It's so far away from us. And so he absolutely and totally ignored it because it would be very inconvenient to assume that Muslims there were being persecuted.
Okay, thank you very much. And stay with us. We're moving on to our next panelist, who is in Lahore. And the internet is slightly up and down, so we may lose him, but let's give it a go. Kunwar Khuldune Shahid is a Pakistan-based correspondent for the Diplomat, an excellent magazine, incidentally, that specializes in Asia. His work has appeared in most mainstream outlets in Europe and North America, and is also a member of the 101 Reporters. That's a pan-Asian network of grassroots reporters. On February the 14th, he published a piece entitled Pakistan Continues to Exhibit Gory Islamophobia Against Ahmadis. Kunwar is going to dig deeper into this term Islamophobia and how it's been co-opted in a way by those pushing for social reform, the progressives. Kunwar, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this webinar. First of all, my apologies for the internet. Like Dr. Hoodbhoy mentioned, there's a protest going on in the country, so they block a lot of signals. I have 3 different devices, so hopefully they'll carry me through, but my apologies nonetheless. The topic, making sense of Islamophobia, Pakistan's Islamophobia syndrome, it's something that I am extremely passionate about because I've spent the past decade or so trying to make sense of Pakistan's Islamophobia syndrome. It's something I've written extensively about. And like Dr. Hoodbhoy mentioned, the reason the term Islamophobia is used and not Muslimophobia, therein lies the problem itself, that the vast majority of the Muslim world seemingly is more interested in shielding Islam from critique than they are interested in protecting Muslims from actual discrimination and bias. And like the previous question discussed, the Uyghur Muslims in China, just to give you an example, the term Islamophobic is used more frequently for a satirical publication in France, Charlie Hebdo, than it is used for the Communist Party of China, which is actually putting Muslims in concentration camps. So therein again lies another example that not only countries like Pakistan, not only leaders like Imran Khan are silent about what's happening in China to Muslims, even the global Muslim narrative does not discuss that aspect of discrimination against Muslims, and it is mostly targeting other parts of the world, and it is somehow co-opted to shield Islam from critique. And I think there are 2 different branches of the Islamophobia narrative that I personally would like to discuss. First is the liberal progressive narrative, which basically argues, which is something we've been discussing, that there's a bias against the Muslims in the West, there is discrimination against Muslims, and that needs to be addressed. I think that's something we can all get behind. Bias against any religious community or any community, anyone with any identity, whether that's religious, sexual, gender, bias against them, discrimination against them should be challenged. I think we can all get behind that. But the other branch of the Islamophobia narrative is the Islamist branch, which peddles a perpetual victimization of Muslims as a whole as well, but more specifically against Islam. The idea that Islam is being targeted around the world, the idea that Islam is in danger, that is the idea that led to the creation of Pakistan. So Islam is in danger, is still under discussion in countries like Pakistan, with the population that over 97% of Muslims of the population in Pakistan, they're Muslims, and yet Islam somehow still is perpetually in danger in Pakistan. Now, why is that? The primary reason is the need for Pakistan to have an Islamist policy. Like it was already discussed in the introduction, the creation of the national identity, you need Islam for that, given how multi-ethnic, multicultural this realm was, and given how nationhood followed the creation of the nation itself, because the nation was there, but there was no concept of a nation. So a lot of fabrication, a lot of artificial ideologies and artificial history had to be peddled to create a Pakistani identity. But you cannot talk about the Islamist reality in Pakistan, and you cannot talk about Islamophobia in Pakistan without addressing the reality in Pakistan. The reality in Pakistan is that you have a blasphemy law by death, where critique of Islam is punishable by death. 20 others have harsh sentences for critique of Islam. Now, one would like to argue that Islamophobia, a term that signifies an irrational fear of Islam, I would like to argue that in these countries, including Pakistan, where I am right now, it is perfectly rational to fear Islam. It might be a radical strain of Islam. It might be more aggressive or more literal strain of Islam, but that has been codified in law. That is the law in this country, that if anything offends your sentiment, you have the right to kill. The punishment for that crime is death. That's the law. So it's not like a fringe people who are just arguing that, we need to kill people to safeguard Islam. That's the law in this country and 11 other Muslim majority countries, but 20 more have, with harsh prison sentences. So is it really fair that somehow the liberal argument, even in countries like ours, focuses on Islamophobia, uses the term Islamophobia, when this is the reality in Pakistan? Blasphemy law, blasphemy lynchings. There are countless examples of violence perpetuated in the name of Islam. And then if you were to argue, and then the only counter argument that you give in Pakistan against those Islamist attacks carried out by mobs is that they weren't following the true version of Islam. I mean, if someone has been killed by a mob in the name of Islam, to discuss whether they were killed by the right version of Islam or the wrong version of Islam, that at the very least is insulting to the victim and their families. The second counter argument that is given against the blasphemy law in Pakistan is that the law is misused by the people. Now, that is an argument, and by the way, this is like a handful of people who even go as far as saying that the blasphemy law itself is being misused, because even criticizing the blasphemy law has led to people being killed, like Salman Taseer, who was the governor of Punjab, who was killed by his own bodyguard, Mumtaz Qadri, in 2011, which led to the creation of TLP, which Dr. Hoodbhoy mentioned, the radical group. So these are the realities in Pakistan. Similarly, you mentioned the article of how the one I wrote in February on Pakistan's own Islamophobia. Now, there is no country in the world, and this is an interesting and sad and interesting and terrible at the same time. There is no country in the world other than Pakistan where you can be prisoned for reading the Quran. You can be prisoned for calling out the Islamic prayer.
And we seem to...
For following any Islamic ritual if you happen to be an Ahmadi Muslim in Pakistan. So there is no country in the world that does anything remotely close to Muslims that Pakistan does to Ahmadi Muslims. Okay, maybe you can argue again China with the concentration camps, but it's a close in Western China. And what Pakistan is, neither of these two atrocities against religious communities ever factor or ever dominate the global Islamophobia narrative. We end up talking about Charlie Hebdo, we end up talking about France. In 1971, France had 33 mosques. There were over 420 temples in Pakistan. Now there are only 20. Not a single temple has been built in the history of Pakistan. Not a single Hindu temple has been built in Pakistan in the history of this country, in the past 75 years. How can this country have any authority, any say over any kind of religious discrimination anywhere in the world? We talk about what's happening in India. There is a clear anti-Muslim sentiment in India. No question, no doubt about that. The Hindutva surge in India is there, absolutely. And yet, as we speak, there is still a mosque being built somewhere in India, multiple even. So if Pakistan thinks it has any moral moral ground to criticize those countries when the reality in Pakistan is quite the contrary. This Islamophobia syndrome, I personally can't make any sense of it, except the fact that, of course, you have to sell Islam in this country for populist reasons, for electoral reasons, and even you need jihadist groups as strategic assets in the region for the power plays. That's the only reason this Islamist narrative of Islamophobia is peddled. And I think for me personally, the line becomes a bit blurry. Whether it's the liberal branch of the Islamophobia narrative or it's the Islamist branch of the Islamophobia narrative. For example, U.S. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who led the Islamophobia bill in the U.S. and was passed in December, she visited Pakistan last month. Now, guess who she met to discuss Islamophobia? Imran Khan. Imran Khan, whose definition of Islamophobia is that there is a genocide of the Muslims going on, genocide in the West. And what is the evidence? Evidence is there is a satirical publication in France that draws the Prophet's cartoons. That is your evidence. Or that the French have an aggressive brand of secularism, the laïcité, which is aggressive against all religions, by the way, not just Islam. That is your evidence of a genocide. So if Ilhan Omar or other Western liberals, if their definition of Islamophobia is to protect the Muslim community against bias and all of that, why is she discussing Islamophobia with someone who has said on record, and I quote Imran Khan when I say this, I want to export the blasphemy law, a global blasphemy law, so that people in the West are scared of blaspheming against Prophet Muhammad. Now, scared. He wants you to be scared. He wants everyone to be scared. And so if that's the idea, if that's Imran Khan's definition of Islamophobia, why are these two different interpretations somehow converging into the same definition, which in the end implies that you don't want to critique Islam. You don't want to allow critique of Islam. And that is where I feel that Pakistan is a microcosm of an ailment that is affecting the broader Muslim world, but not so micro because there are over 200 million people living here. So that's what I feel about Pakistan and the Islamophobia syndrome in the country.
Thank you very much there. I just want to go a little broader or deeper into this separation, because Imran Khan, and you were saying in this sort of anti-Muslim element from the West, but then you have the internal Islamic friction, and you wrote that piece about gory Islamophobia against Ahmadis. Could you outline for us, if you have the figures on the tip of your tongue, as it were, the Sunni, Shia, Ahmadi divisions in a sort of in Pakistan?
Broadly, around the 80% of Pakistan's population is Sunni Muslim. 1/5, the rest 20% broadly is Shia Muslims, because they are the officially constitutionally approved Muslims in the country. Ahmadis in Pakistan, unfortunately, there has been an exodus, understandably so, in the country, but I think they amount to somewhere around 5 million Ahmadis in Pakistan, which is a tiny minority, which is less than the number of Hindus in the country, less than the number of Christians. But the excommunication of the Ahmadiyya Islamic sect actually resulted in the domino effect, where now you have calls for the Shia Muslims to be excommunicated as well, because you differ over other interpretations of Islam. For example, the Sunnis have their hierarchical order of the caliphs, the Shia have their imams, and of course they have a different interpretation of history. So at the end of the day, once you excommunicated, apostatized one sect, that laid the foundation for the same thing to go on. And even within Sunni Islam, you have the Wahhabis or the Salafis. You have the Deobandis. You have now the Barelvi Islamic sect, which Dr. Hoodbhoy mentioned, that is supposed to be an interpretation of Sunni, of Sufi Islam. Now you have Sufi ideologues of Sufi Islams who are perpetuating terrorism in the country in the name of safeguarding the honor of the Prophet. The honor of the Prophet, or the blasphemy law itself, has been weaponized in the country by different sects who have different interests, and somehow all converge when it comes to protecting Islam from critique.
And all of this, that breakdown that you very clearly gave us just now, together with the Western or Christian, whatever you want to call it, thing with Islam, that is all termed as Islamophobia, is it?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Sorry.
So all of that friction that you just explained to us within Islam, coupled with the geopolitical, as it were, Muslim West Islam thing, that is all loosely termed as Islamophobia issue.
I think the friction within Islam and within Islamic sects is more a sectarian warfare within Islam itself. And when we talk about Islamophobia, it is a collective, or at least as it is understood. It is understood as more a collective discrimination or a bias against Muslims as a whole. I mean, in terms of the global narrative, you probably don't go down into which sect is being targeted more by people outside of Islam. But within Islam, of course, if it's a Sunni majority country like Pakistan, the Sunni sect is more dominant. And then it depends on what the reality is for other sects, like, for example, in Ahmadis, or even within Shia Islam as well. You have Ismailis as well. They are excommunicated in certain parts as well. So there is an internal warfare, and you normally don't use the term Islamophobia for them. It was just my way of saying that if that is Islamophobia, what on earth is this? Is why I use that term for what's happening to
Okay, that's great. Whilst your internet is holding up so brilliantly, and you've been doing wonderfully with it, one last question from a member of our audience, Anand Singh Tomar, and I'll rephrase it slightly. It asks, has the term Islamophobia become a political tool for Pakistan? So add a little bit to that thought, because we've had that answered already.
Sorry, didn't catch anything. Sorry.
Has the term Islamophobia become a political tool for Pakistan?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, and I would like to argue it's become a political tool around the world, because you're silencing critique of Islam, you're silencing dissent, because I would like to argue that no one benefits more from critique of Islam than we Muslims. Muslims are the first, because you need reform in Islam. That there is no question about that. And reform not just in the theological sense, but reform in how Islam is treated as a religion. Religion is supposed to be a fraction of your identity, or a part of the societal discourse. You cannot have religion in the law and then expect an egalitarian democratic society. In a democratic society, all people need to be equal. In Pakistan, not only does the constitution decide who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim, there's a clear elevation of Islam and Muslims. For example, blasphemy. If death for blasphemy against Islam is death. That's not the punishment for blasphemy against Hinduism. And blasphemy against Hinduism is prevalent across the curricula, across the national discourse, and that's how it is. So it has been weaponized as a political tool, definitely in Pakistan, but in other parts of the world as well.
Kunwar, thank you so much for that clarity and moving our debate on so skillfully from Lahore with its dodgy internet. Please stick with us if you can. And we are now going to Jocelyne Cesari, Professor of Religion and Politics at the University of Birmingham and a visiting professor at the Harvard Divinity School. Among her recent books are What is Political Islam and We, God's People, Christianity, Islam and Hinduism in the World of Nations. Jocelyne is going to be highlighting the many contradictions that we've been discussing and the alarming transformation of a state aimed at being a safe haven for Muslims. Jocelyne, tell us what you know.
Hi, hello, everybody. I'm going to use a few slides and PowerPoint. So next one, please. So I'm not going to insist on that quotation because Lord Bruce already mentioned it, but I want to emphasize the dramatic and painful transformation of the whole Indian subcontinent that under the Mughal, which was actually a Muslim minority ruling the Indian subcontinent, this was the most interesting and rich example of inclusiveness and tolerance among religions, all of them, not only different sects of Islam, but also Hindus. and Sikhs and Christians and Baha'is. So that this diversity has gone, and we can see the temptation of an Hindu nation in the modern state of India. And we have seen, unfortunately, the evolution of Pakistan that was created as a shelter for Muslims, with also the goal to remain open and inclusive of religious diversity toward a more and more sectarian form of Islamic state. Next slide, please. So how do we explain this? This is a term we are using it today, but I would have some reservation on it when we are looking at this particular situation. It's a combination of two elements: the hegemonic form of Islam and salafization, that is also a global trend. Next slide, please. So what is hegemonic Islam? It's a term I have forged in 2014, looking at the way that states across Muslim countries are interacting with Islam. And I want to make it clear here that this hegemonic form of Islam is a shared feature across all Muslim countries that share either one or two or even three of the features I'm listing here, except the exception to this hegemonic Islam are Lebanon, which has been built as a sectarian democracy with all the challenges that goes with it, Senegal, and Indonesia. Otherwise, all across the Muslim world, you will find one or two or three of these elements. In the case of Pakistan, unfortunately, the three are present. Next slide, please. So what is nationalization of institution and clerics? It means that as early as the 60s, the state brought religious endowment and shrines under the control of the Awqaf, the religious endowment department, and the Advisory Council for Islamic Ideology. And again, this is an unprecedented situation, unlike what people think in Muslim empires and pre-nation state. The clerics, the endowments, the Islamic institution were independent from the political power. They had their own financial means, they had their own internal process of recruitment and selection of religious authority, and their own way of providing religious guidance. This is gone, and I'm going to say it clearly, this is gone not only in Pakistan, everywhere, even in the so-called secular Turkey. So that's something to take into account. The second element that is also very common is that most religious authorities were incorporated into the bureaucracy of the state and became employees, civil servants. So it doesn't give you a lot of room for critical thinking or even taking into account what was to be the common good. The good of the community has become, maslaha has become the good of the state, of the public interest, which is also a big shift for the pre-national form of Islam. And finally, the state controls the content of the khutbah, the Friday sermons in the mosque. And again, this is something that happened everywhere. And so already there, even before the al-Haq, you have the element that will build Islam and a certain brand of Islam, which is the dominant denomination associated with the elite that build the country, that would create not only a state policy, this is actually secondary, it's a mentality, it's an approach to Islam that has changed the way that Muslims as citizens interact with their tradition. And this is very serious. And again, I'm not saying that Pakistan is unique in this regard, but what is unique is the other aspect. Next slide, please. Which is the Islamization of law that went very far in Pakistan, more than it went in any of the other Muslim countries that I have studied, except Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Taliban when they were, or maybe even now, when they are in charge of government. All other Muslim countries have introduced Islamic prescription in family law. In other words, it's very rare, except Lebanon now, to find Muslim countries that have a civil secular law. Marriage, divorce, custody of children everywhere is shaped by Islamic prescription. That's what everybody calls Sharia law, although it's a very reduced and politicized form of Sharia that has been included in the legal system of most Muslim countries. What Pakistan did is, as soon as 1973, so even before the Al-Haq, to include specific legislation and constitutional amendment to single out and illegitimize, even in some ways make illegal some forms of Muslim, and that, for example, defining Ahmadis as non-Muslim. So I'm not going to read the whole article or clause, you have it here, but that's something that has not happened at this level in other Muslim countries, although, of course, religious minorities at large are also discriminated everywhere in this process of homogenization and creating a certain brand of Islam, which is usually the dominant in the demographic of the country, but not automatically, and making it the public culture. It's more than policies. It's the way that people are educated about their own country, and to be a national is to be a Muslim of a certain brand. So it means it illegalizes or illegitimizes a lot of other trends, not only of non-Muslims, but also of Muslims. Next slide, please. So to continue on this Islamization of law, with the introduction of martial law under the Al-Haq, as it was mentioned, the Islamization went even a step further. There was the 1979 Hudud ordinances, which means that some aspect of the criminal law in Pakistan, although there have been attempts of reform, but some aspects of penal law or criminal law are based on Islam. And it means that, for example, Jinnah, fornication, is not only a sin, but it's a crime that is punished by law. So you have lots of women who are imprisoned and in jail. This is a huge problem that on not always the conviction, but just simply the assumption of fornication or adultery. Again, this is not the case in most of Muslim majority countries, but it's the case in a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, or under the Taliban. So that's something that went one step further. We mentioned the blasphemy law of 1982, and even more, one step further was the laws of 1984 that reiterated the discriminatory nature of the 74 law prohibiting Ahmadis from referring themselves as Muslim, but also criminalize their religious practice. Next slide, please. So before I move on to the globalization of Salafism, we have here the building of a national culture, of a political culture that put Islam, a certain brand of Islam defined and molded by the state institution, central to the way that people identify themselves. And I didn't mention here also the national narrative and the education that creates the national history. You know, how do we say we as Pakistani? Again, this particular limited approach to Islam is central to the national narrative. So the second aspect also is the globalization of Salafism, which is here in this particular case, the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. And what has been worrisome more than in any other Muslim countries is the failure of the public education system. The literacy rate is estimated even now around 40, and it's a higher estimate. And it means that it has given room to multiple madrasas that have been funded by Saudis. And this is the soft power of Saudi Arabia. This is something we are not emphasizing enough, especially in the West. It is that this Wahhabi interpretation is the most intolerant, the most essentialized approach to Islam that has ever been offered to Muslims. And it is not a traditional one. Actually, it's a modern one, but the Saudis present it as a traditional, authentic way of being Muslim. And that's the problem, because when you do not have strong traditional teaching and transmission of Islam, the people are very vulnerable to this particular offering that is in itself problematic, because it has created the condition for the rise everywhere of what I call public morality. It is not enough in the Wahhabi way, and now I would say in the adapted Pakistani way, to act outside your home, and sometimes the police is also in your home, as a free person. You have to follow a certain number of codes, of behaviors, and if you don't follow them, it's not just God is going to punish you, it's that the state is going to punish you, it's that your neighbor has the right and sometimes a duty to punish you. That's what some have called, unfortunately, the Talibanization of Pakistani society. So we have moved very far away from the shelter of Muslim as a place of safety for Muslim, to a place where there is continuous tension about the right way of being a Muslim, and continuous tension between different interpretation of being the right Muslim. And that's this particular national culture that I want to emphasize, because it is not also the state. The people have also evolved according to education, urbanization, but also education. When in a country you have less than 40% of the people literate, and when you have delegated the education of your citizen to Saudi-funded madrasas, the intolerance is there. And that's something we have also to address. And so I'm going to conclude on that by saying that if you combine these two, you may better understand the tragedy of the current Islamic culture in Pakistan, and also the fact that all statistics, and I have showed that in any forms of hegemonic Islam, and you could say this with hegemonic Buddhism in some Buddhist countries that are far from being tolerant either, you have the highest probability of discrimination and loss of civil liberties for all citizens, but particularly minorities and women. And I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Just to recap, if I'm correct, is that this path that Pakistan has been on and is at now began practically after the partition, under Jinnah, under Bhutto, but way before Zia. That's correct, is it?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
So the Pakistani elite, the politicians, were moving Pakistan in that direction.
Yes. I mean, what we tend to forget is that nation and state are not synonymous. We live in the West with the understanding that nation and state, people get together, they like to be together, and they, form institutions that go with that. What we have seen in most Muslim countries, and again, I have written extensively on that, everywhere the state came before the nation. There is no Turkey until Kemal Atatürk. There is no Pakistan until Dr. Jinnah. And people live locally in a very rich diversity. But this diversity will be at some point eroded to create the national culture. And what I show in my work is that this national culture, unfortunately, went to the detriment of the richness and inclusiveness of what was to be a Muslim, you know, and interacting with others.
And could you shed a light perhaps on how the military, which we know has so much influence and control on Pakistan, how that, you know, where does it stand as these laws were passed time and time and time again? Was it pushed by the military? Did they accept it? Was it their idea?
They went with it. I mean, since the beginning, the Pakistani elite, which was the Gujarati elite, knew that they could not do without Islam, because that was the major ferment of identification and emotional belonging for most of people. And this is true everywhere. This is not specific to Pakistan. So the idea was to build a national culture that make room for Islam. But the way this could have been done would have, you know, there are different ways. Senegal is a Muslim country with a majority. It went another way. Indonesia went another way. In most of other cases, the idea was to nationalize. And I don't think it's only the military. It was the vision of the elite with the idea, which was very Western, that on the long run, you know, religion is going to become more and more privatized or even disappear. These were people educated in the West. It was true in Tunisia with Bourguiba, with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and with not only Dr. Jinnah, but the elite around it. And
then the you know, the sort of banning, as it were, or the redefining of a strain of Islam, the Ahmadis. When that happened, was there any objection from anywhere else in the world apart from the Ahmadis themselves?
I don't think so. I have not heard of any protest because this is a prerogative of building the nation state. A nation is a modern political community where people have self-determination. It's very rare, although we are living in a world today where we poke more into the domestic politics of country, but still you can see this prerogative. You know, who prevented Putin to invade Ukraine? This is what makes a nation, this self-determination and sovereignty. So, and also if you do not present it, I mean, most of these leaders, not only Pakistani, it's true in Tunisia, it's true in Egypt, they present themselves as liberal. The term liberal in these countries doesn't mean the same thing when we use it in the West. And it's also part of the continuous misunderstanding. I lived a long time in Algeria. I have never seen that as the most perfect political or PR approach, telling to the West exactly, especially to the French, what they want to hear. And you don't go under the surface.
Can I put a question from one of our audience to you, which is up on the screen from Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore? Can, or perhaps we should say, how can the institutionalization of sect-based discrimination be brought to an end in Pakistan?
That's the $100, I mean, more than that question, because as I said, at this stage, it has also, it serves it has been said also by the other speakers, it serves political goal. I mean, it is with the current today to associate being a Pakistani with being a certain kind of Sunni Muslim, but more than that, more observant and conservative and strict than it was before. And so I don't think there is any political incentive from a domestic point of view today.
So it's going. That is going to continue. That's very grim. But please stay with us, and we're now going to go to the heart of the problem, in a way, or to the heart of the issue, to Farid Ahmed, the National Secretary for External Affairs of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the UK, which incidentally built the first ever mosque in London in 1926. So this is not a new grouping at all. The philosophy of the Ahmadiyya Muslims on its website is centered on education, integration, and interfaiths peace. Farid Ahmed was going to give his view on the challenges facing Ahmadi Muslims. Farid, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And I would like to start by saying that our community, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, has always been supportive of Pakistan as a country. After all, as a peace-loving community, we've been there at the forefront serving Pakistan ever since its inception. Our members were leading lights in the history with key figures, including Sir Muhammad Zafrullah Khan, Pakistan's first foreign minister, and Pakistan's first and only Nobel laureate in science, Professor Abdus Salam. So it pains us when we see Pakistan suffer, and our prayers will always be for the success of Pakistan. Now, with regards to Pakistan's work on tackling Islamophobia, I hope, perhaps optimistically, that its intentions may have been good. Any actions, after all, that tackle hatred must be welcomed. And I'm sure that the tens of millions of citizens of Pakistan have a deep love for the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, in their hearts, as do Ahmadi Muslims. However, on this issue, I believe the people of Pakistan have been let down by their leadership. And whilst that is not an issue unique to Pakistan, Pakistan being the country under discussion, I will focus on this. Now, why do I say they've been let down, especially if they've secured a day to tackle Islamophobia? Well, the fact is that on any issue, you need to be true to yourself, to your cause. For example, one cannot advocate vegetarianism all for all while having beef burgers for lunch. But metaphorically, it is exactly this that Pakistan government has been doing. Let me explain. In speeches and statements advocating action against Islamophobia, Pakistan's ministers and UN representatives stated why this was needed. Let me quote here Pakistan's Prime Minister in his letter to Muslim world leaders in 2020, where he said that action was needed because European countries, he decried, in European countries, mosques were being closed. And he said that it's incumbent on us as leaders of the Muslim world to collectively take the lead in breaking this cycle of hate and extremism, which nurtures violence and even death, and end cycles of violence bred of ignorance and hate. Pakistan's UN envoy in the General Assembly Hall said such acts of discrimination, hostility, and violence towards Muslims constitute grave violations of their human rights and violate freedom of religion and belief. And the objectives of Pakistan's UN resolution included to promote a message of tolerance, peaceful coexistence, interfaith and cultural harmony among religions, races and nations, and to demonstrate unfettered solidarity with all humanity, convey a strong message of peace, respect for human dignity, and to reiterate our common commitment to unity in diversity. Now, this is all very good and noble, and you'd expect that with such concerns for human rights, Pakistan would be a haven for religious harmony in line with its own founding vision as laid out by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, that there should be complete religious freedom. Sadly, the truth is very different, and it undermines the call for religious tolerance. The suffering of Pakistan's own religious communities are a stark case in point, and none more so than the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. It is unique because it is the only community, and I repeat, the only community to face state-sponsored persecution. Let me explain. We've heard about the laws. In 1974, its constitution was amended to declare Ahmadis as non-Muslim. This law still stands. In 1984, Ordinance 20 was used, the anti-Ahmadi laws, to make it a criminal offense for Ahmadis to call themselves Muslims or to practice their faith, and face 3 years imprisonment for this. These laws still stand, but that is not all. The institutional discrimination is cradle to grave in its use of laws. When an Ahmadi is born, they cannot register as a Muslim. When they go to school, they cannot register as a Muslim. They are targeted by hate material in textbooks. When they apply for a passport, they cannot apply as a Muslim. And all Muslims must sign a declaration declaring Ahmadis as non-Muslims. All these laws and rules still stand. I ask you, is the government's care for religious sentiments not relevant for Ahmadi Muslims too? But sadly, the situation has worsened over recent years. For example, there's increasing judicial bias. In 2018, the Islamabad High Court, in a judgment, called for Ahmadis to be targeted and identifiable through names, their clothes, and to be identified when applying for roles in the civil service and the armed forces. And last month, bails were denied by the Supreme Court for Ahmadis in prison on grounds of faith, on the grounds that the court did not want to consider the merits of the case. What sort of court does not review evidence? In May 2020, Ahmadis were excluded from the National Commission for Minorities, and between June 2020 and November 2021, several National Assembly resolutions and regulations and requirements require anti-Ahmadi narratives. The Khatm-e-Nabuwwat Declaration, which is taken to be anti-Ahmadi because it calls for a denial of Ahmadi beliefs, to be made in all school textbooks, to be displayed in schools, government offices, and even on wedding registration forms. And rather than focusing on breaking barriers of ignorance and promoting education, book bans have been introduced against the Ahmadi Muslims. The Punjab Act in 2011 prohibits us from publishing the Holy Quran. And in Punjab, all Ahmadi periodicals and books of the founder are banned. At the same time, look what happens against the community. Material that's published calling for hate and violence is published freely with no action taken by the state. So where is the care for religious sentiments here? The state and authorities are operating in tandem with the police destroying Ahmadi mosques because they look like mosques, and authorities desecrating Ahmadi graves, even if the name of the deceased happens to be an Islamic name. 139 graves have been desecrated since 2021. Ahmadis clearly cannot even find peace after death. And we've seen these laws widen in scope. More recently, the cyber laws in November 2020, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016, PECA, calls upon the Pakistan Telecommunications Authority, rather than a court, to decide if online material is blasphemous and to order its removal. And the first use of these laws was against Ahmadis, and Ahmadis have been charged and arrested for sharing material online, material like the Holy Quran. The impact of these laws, as you can imagine, is very real. 11 Ahmadis have been killed in the past 18 months. And just in the past week, the horrific murder of 32-year-old Abdul Salam, who was stabbed to death in front of his two young children, aged 2 and 6. For what crime? For being an Ahmadi Muslim. They are prisoners of conscience, languishing in jails. 103 Ahmadi mosques and have had their kalima, the fundamental creed of the Islamic faith, removed. Mosques have been attacked, sealed, and forcibly occupied. But it's not just religious rights, even basic civic rights have been denied. Ahmadis are the only community in Pakistan that are denied the right to vote. To vote, an Ahmadi must either declare himself to be a non-Muslim or to declare his founder an imposter. We have elections coming up in the next year or so. Will this change? We will find out. What these laws testify to is the fact that this is not about mob violence or discrimination by non-state actors. There's plenty of that. But it's about the actions of the state and the legislature, and the persecution is, in every sense, institutionalized. But what this shows is that there's a double standard at play. How can Pakistan's leaders call for an end to Islamophobia and the need for religious harmony when they are completely failing to tackle such issues at home? And the hollow nature of its work to secure the UN resolution was laid plain when the Prime Minister at a rally said that this was the greatest victory since the time Ahmadis, or Qadianis, a derogatory term, were declared non-Muslim. So there we have it. And when Pakistan talks about wanting to follow Islam, it fails to uphold Islam. Islam teaches what Islam teaches is poles apart from what is practiced in Pakistan. Islam is very clear. It is the solution. It is the glue that can bring societies together in peace. It states in chapter 2, verse 257, there should be no compulsion in religion. And we've heard about the Charter of Medina that gave complete freedom of religion. These are the principles to which Ahmadi Muslims adhere. And let me quote here our leader, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, who said, "It is never permissible in any circumstances to force another person to accept Islam, or indeed any religion. All people are free to believe or not to believe." And so when the Holy Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was permitted only to convey the message of Islam and nothing further, how then can the so-called Muslim leaders of today go beyond this and think they have more power and authority or rights than the Prophet of Islam? If only Pakistan followed such wise guidance. So in summary, let me remind that in Pakistan, Ahmadis cannot call their places of worship a mosque, they cannot make the call to prayer, they cannot call themselves Muslims, they cannot publish the Quran, our mosques are desecrated, our minarets are torn down by the authorities. We face a barrage of extremism in person and online. And when Ahmadis are murdered in mosques or anywhere, no sympathy or solidarity is shown by the government. Why I have emphasized this is because it is very pertinent to the UN Day on Islamophobia that Pakistan lobbied for. Pakistan used the day of 15th March, on which the horrific massacre occurred of 50 Muslims killed in Christchurch, New Zealand, and it used that day to be the day of action on Islamophobia. This could not be more ironic. Let me state how New Zealand responded to that tragedy. New Zealanders gathered together at mosques in a show of solidarity. The Prime Minister visited the victims and the mosques and made clear her complete rejection of such violence. The Prime Minister allowed the mosque to broadcast a public call to prayer. The Prime Minister wore the hijab as a show of solidarity. She vowed to take action on the perpetrators, vowed to tackle online hatred and extremism, and even awarded honors to the 10 people who saved others, who gave their life saving others during the attacks. So I put it to you that it is New Zealand rather than Pakistan that has shown that this is how you tackle religious hatred. This is how you build cohesion. This is how you lead the world. This is the true means of achieving social peace, and in essence, the best means to tackle Islamophobia. You do not do this by denying the rights, but by upholding rights and religious freedom. You do it by building credibility for your cause so others can take you seriously. You lead by example. So I close by stressing that we Ahmadi Muslims want to build peace. We want Pakistan to succeed. And it is our hope that Pakistan turns a corner to serve its citizens, all of them, equally, so that there is not just an end to anti-Muslim or anti-Islam hatred, but there is a respect for all faiths, for all people as one humanity. Thank you.
Fareed, thank you very much for that very moving and compelling testament and address, really. What is the population of the Ahmadi community in Pakistan?
It's a good question, because in Pakistan, you cannot carry out a census of how many Ahmadis there are. If you go around knocking door to door, you'll find that there'll be trouble. So our estimates are that there's probably less than 1 million now that we know about and can vouch for. But that estimate could vary because, we've had 50 years of persecution where to call yourself a Muslim has meant imprisonment.
Yeah, and to say at partition, it would have been a much higher percentage of the population?
Absolutely. It would have been much more at that stage, as the community was there. It was founded in India and was established in the subcontinent.
But why? What is not the justification, but what would be the political or security or whatever reason for doing what is being done?
Sorry, Humphrey, you cut out. So could you repeat the question?
Oh, I said you're probably the wrong person to ask. But what is the reason, the justification, for the Pakistan state over these many decades carrying out this policy?
I believe it's a politicization of religion, and the politics of it is to seize power. What is fascinating is that when this movement first turned violent, one of the calls by the leaders at that time was that Sir Zafrullah Khan, Pakistan's first foreign minister, should be removed from post. So they saw him as a barrier to their political progress. That's the conclusion you draw. And if you look at the history of Pakistan thereon, as the extremists gained the upper hand, the country went from bad to worse in upholding freedom of religion and the equality of citizens. So it's a means to power for them, and unfortunately that goes completely against the founding vision of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which said that there should be separation of religion and state.
So that was that sort of merging that we see now in Pakistan. And what has been the react, say, from institutions like the Commonwealth and that to this? Has there been any specific condemnation of it?
There have been many condemnations from the United Nations, from the European Union and other governments around the world and other institutions. But, condemnations are one thing. Pakistan can choose to ignore such condemnations, as it has done for many years. There's been no real accountability of its record to date.
Okay, that's and to get us back to before I open up to the panel again here, we're talking about Islamophobia here, and is this Islamophobia? Is this internal friction we were talking about within Islam?
I think there's two ways of looking at this. Islamophobia could be a proxy for saying that we want peace and harmony, religious peace and harmony in society, and we all stand for that. But you can't have Islamophobia by defining, well, we think these peoples are Muslims and therefore protected under these actions to defend and uphold actions against Islamophobia, and these people are not. I think that undermines the credibility of your cause straight away.
Yes, yeah, and absolutely, and we've got a couple of questions from the audience here, so I'll put the first one to you, and then open these themes up to the panel. In fact, I'll put both of the questions out, and if you could address them first, and then we'll go around. Dr. Asif Shah, decent individual Pakistanis will be the answer to religious tolerance in Pakistan. Decent individual Pakistanis, if so, how would that happen? And then Nazlim Alam says, would the panel agree that the best way to counter so-called Islamophobia would be the first to condemn terror conducted in the name of Islam? Fareed, your thoughts?
Of course. I think the solution has got to be the teaching of basic humanitarian principles, that people are equal, that people have freedom, they have human rights. We do not need to debate the religious theologies between one group and another to have harmony in society. So I think in Pakistan, if the schools and the institutions teach that to children, you will then bring up a generation that has a greater respect for each other, as human beings, and a sense of natural justice that should flow throughout society. And in terms of the second question, which I've forgotten as I answered the first, if you could kindly remind me.
So the second question is similar, but it is slightly different. Is that would the panel agree that the best way to counter so-called Islamophobia would be first to condemn terror conducted in the name of Islam?
I think you should condemn terror conducted full stop, whether it's in the name of Islam, whether it's in the name of any religion or any cause. Islam itself condemns terrorism, and so there is no justification for terrorism. And that's the principle which forms the basis for peace.
Okay. Pervez, can we come back to you now and put those 2 points to you? First one, decent individual Pakistanis, how can they be the answer to religious tolerance? And then the condemnation of terror, because of course Pakistan was very much involved in the Taliban and of course over into Kashmir and other things as well. What are your thoughts on those two questions?
Well, absolutely. We need a lot more decent people among Muslims, but also among all peoples of this world. It's only through exercising individual conscience and then putting support behind secular humanistic movements that one can hope to change the direction of humanity. I am hopeful that that will happen, because if you look at what Europe was 300 years ago, well, we're not quite as bad as that. And since Europe managed to get out of it, hopefully we can as well. But it will need political mobilization, and it will need a lot of shoulders behind this. As far as terrorism goes?
Sorry, just okay. In that respect, though, from what we've heard, particularly from Fareed and Jocelyne, so Pakistan has been going backwards over many decades with nothing stopping to pull it the other direction again.
There has been enormous regression. But let me say that 4 years ago, things were not quite as bad as they were now. When we had Nawaz Sharif there, he did not fan the flames of Islamophobia as Imran Khan does at the moment. In fact, he had called Ahmadis as his brothers. And so, although he was unable to change the direction of things, that was at least an admission that Pakistan needs to treat its minorities better. So there are currents within the Pakistani political establishment I would say that the People's Party, for all its other deficiencies, is also not committed to making Pakistan into a religious state as Imran Khan is.
And when you say unable to change, why was he unable to change it?
Because over time there has been such a big base of people who subscribe to the religious way of thinking that to tell them that this has to be changed cannot be done overnight. What has to be done is is not to advertise, but to work in ways that will reduce the role of religion in matters of the state, and in particular in education. And also in terms of the use of religious symbolisms in let's say festivals, national holidays, and so forth.
And that's
now
not
coming to terrorism.
Sorry, the terrorism now. Yes, please. Yep.
Yeah, you were asking about terrorism, or rather the question was, and I'd say yes, absolutely. Terrorism needs to be condemned. If it happens in the name of Islam, it has to be condemned again with full force. But terrorism is not confined to Islam alone. I mean, one sees horrific things happening in India these days, and that too is religion which has now been uncaged over there. So religion needs to be put back into the cage everywhere. Not just Pakistan, but everywhere, Afghanistan, Iran, and I'd say parts of the United States as well, which...
Absolutely. Thank you. Stay with us, because Kunwar, could you give us your thoughts on whether there is, individual Pakistanis, can they nail this problem or not?
Not for me, no. This is way beyond individual Pakistanis. I mean, I think the other question was, should a way to counter so-called Islamophobia. I like the use of so-called because I find the term itself slightly misleading. Is the way to counter that condemning terrorism? I think that's a really low threshold. That's the bare minimum that any community can do to condemn terrorism, and you'll find a lot of people who are already doing that. I would go as far as saying that to counter Islamophobia, you need Muslim leaders to utter the following line, and you won't find anyone saying the following line: nobody should be killed for blasphemy against Islam. You will not find a single Muslim leader anywhere in the world, let alone in Pakistan,
I think Fareed was saying that. Fareed, you were saying that, weren't you? Are you still with us?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's been not just said once, but many times that there is no punishment for blasphemy in Islam. That is our view. It's stated clearly and repeatedly. And I think within Pakistan, what we need is to stop seeing people on the basis of religion as different. They need citizens must be seen as equal citizens of society. If you can get that at the basic, then you will start building Pakistan back up.
But then, of course, in Pakistan, you're not recognized as a Muslim. That's the point, isn't it, Kunwar?
I should have been clear. Of course, Mr. Fareed Ahmad, and I think Ahmadiyya Muslim community as a whole has been critical of the blasphemy laws and the idea that people should be killed for blasphemy. But if you look around, what I meant was global Muslim leaders. You have laws in 12 countries that say that this is the punishment. Whether or not that's true Islam is a redundant debate, given the fact that these are laws in these countries. 12 countries, death penalty. 20 more countries, harsh prison sentences. So if these countries do not understand anything about Islam, who's teaching them? Where's the narrative coming from? Yes, the Ahmadiyya Muslims are saying these things. They are the peace builders. I agree with them completely. But then they are being sidelined and being told that you're not Muslims at all. So I think condemning terrorism is not only the first step, that's an easy step. You need to say
Can I just clarify is that Pakistan, as we know, was intricately involved in the Taliban in Afghanistan, which was the war on terror, which was at the heart of the war on terror, and has been involved in Kashmir and other instances in India. Are there any leaders in Pakistan, military or civilian, who condemn that policy?
Absolutely none. Even I would go even as far as saying that our progressive left, they are the ones peddling the similar, Islamophobia narrative. They somehow equate France and the Taliban. That's the hyperbolic narrative in Pakistan right now. There is nobody who would utter the simple line that there should be no blasphemy law. There's nobody condemning the law itself. Very few people. Yes, people have been killed for doing so. Yes, there's a danger in saying these things. But if you can't say such fundamental things, and that's because of fear, then
But you're sitting in
that is
Lahore
where,
at the moment telling us this, aren't you? So there is a certain leeway and freedom.
thankfully I have microphones and my neighborhood can't hear me, but nobody knows me, nobody cares. Nobody knows, and nobody cares what I say. I'm talking about leaders who are representatives, and unfortunately there are not even a handful of people stating these basic facts. We talk about freedom of speech, we talk about freedom of religion. Just to give you an example, Washington Post, a premier US publication, published a column by Hamid Mir, who's a top journalist, a big voice on freedom of speech. The column he wrote was on freedom of religion and how Pakistan does not have freedom of religion. Fair enough. But if you ask Hamid Mir what his view on blasphemy law is, he has said on TV that people do deserve to be killed for blasphemy because that is what Islam says. That is the irony of Pakistan.
Okay. Thank you. Jocelyne, are you still with us? Because I'd love your view. You gave us that wonderful arc of sort of regression or progression, whatever you want to call it. Decent individual Pakistanis, are they the answer? Is that a possibility?
I would say yes, but for this you have to create what we call a critical mass of mobilization. And you have wonderful people and they are tolerant, but how many of those would be ready to mobilize to change the current political balance? This can be done. Actually, we mentioned the US, that is indeed a very biased, racist, based on slavery country. And but something happened. That was the civil rights movement, and it happened because segments of citizens who were not African American decided to mobilize in favor of equality of rights. And it has changed the narrative. It didn't suppress racism. It's still there, unfortunately. But it means that it is not right to treat people in a certain way, that there are consequences for it. And that's something that can happen again. For me, the approach is not changing the law; it is changing the mentality. And the issue is that we have a state that has not provided decent ways of educating its own citizens. Most of the elite educates its kids outside in the West. I live in the US. I can tell you there are all here in very good universities, and they are in the UK as well. So, but what happens for the people who have to go to the madrasa just because their kids can get food or clothes? I mean, there are consequences to that. So we are in a globalized world. There are resources outside there that can be out of the hands of a neo-Wahhabi or neo-Salafi interpretation. And for that, we have also responsibility as West. When as Westerners, we agree to condemn terrorism with the Prince Salman in Saudi Arabia, oh, we don't do terrorism. I'm sorry. I mean, if they don't harm the people, the ideology is there. So there are lots of things here that the poor Pakistani can deal with. There is structural all converge. It's what I was culture.
it was a really interesting point about the globalization aspect. It was really, you should always help your brother, whether he's and in a good world, you've seen
make the
I also think that they were certain of the king. When they joined the movement for Pakistan, they were cognizant of the fact that this was to be a state based upon religion. It was to be for Muslims. Now, it's their bad luck that after a while, the forces that wanted them to be declared non-Muslim triumphed. But clearly that was evident way back, because the Ahmadiyya issue had been present much before the creation of Pakistan. And I think they really made a mistake in wanting Pakistan. And they did join forces with Mr. Jinnah very enthusiastically. And Mr. Jinnah was calling for the division of India on a religious basis. It was clear as day at that time.
Okay, so thank you for that. There's everybody wants to come in on this, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have everybody come in on what they want to do. Barry Gardiner, who we're coming to in a minute, is frozen, so we might have a second more. Oh no, he's back, so we're going to Barry imminently. But just can we go round from there, starting with Fareed? Come in on your point, but very quickly I want to say, if there is a new Pakistani mindset, say, with the military and the government and the school curriculum, what is the one thing that would be evidence of it moving forward? Would it be the recognition of the Ahmadis? Would it be the blasphemy law? What would it be, just in one word? Fareed?
Okay, thank you. So just to come back on a couple of points. I mean, I do not agree with my respected panel member in terms of the fact that Islam is a religion of peace. It absolutely is a religion of peace. The wars that were fought during the time of the Prophet were defensive wars. And the Quran, as I've explained, makes it very clear there should be no compulsion in religion, and you cannot have a statement and then the Prophet going against that statement, that divine commandment. And we've seen examples of Islam spread by peace across the world. And secondly, on the point about the Ahmadis and their support for Pakistan, we did support the creation of Pakistan, but it was a secular Pakistan and not the Pakistan we see today. So what's happened since then is an evolution, as happens in many countries. Unfortunately, it's taken a turn for the worse. But the principles, if you look at the Islamic principles of governance in Medina, those are the principles that were supported. So everybody had religious freedom. And lastly, on your point, in terms of what could be done to change Pakistan, what would be
one thing? Yes, just one
thing. I think it would be to treat people equally. As citizens, that would be the basis for change.
Actually treat people equally instead of just saying it and not doing it. I'm going down the list. So Jocelyne, you're next on my list. Can you come in with your point and then answer my question? What is the one thing that would show Pakistan's going in a new direction?
Yeah, I want to say first that we should not single one religion saying that it's more violent than others. This is not historically accurate. I'm talking here as a specialist of religion, and all religion can show potential for either peace or violence, and we have to take into account the trajectory. And to go back to the Medina moment, this is quite unique in anthropology of religion. This is a monotheistic religion that creates off the start a document, not a constitution, because this is anachronistic. Nobody had constitution at the time, that acknowledge the religious diversity. I'm telling you, Christianity didn't do that. If you were not a Catholic, you could not exist and you were killed.
Can I? I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're running out of time. Give us your one symbol that will.
What I'm saying is, what conditions are making a religion more tolerant or intolerant, and we should not look at modernization as a progress. in my work, the modernization that happened in Muslim country was indeed a regression, because we have this idea that modernization goes with emancipation, liberation. In some way it does, and in some it does, others it doesn't. And that's where religion can play on both sides. So it's not good or bad, it's when and how is it good or bad.
It's used. Okay, thank you so much for that. Kunwar, can you come in on what's the one thing that we would see Pakistan sort of changing mindset?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think the one thing that is needed right now is to bring the discourse out of Islam itself, whether Islam is a religion of peace or whether it's not. That should not be relevant, because my argument is, should Pakistan have blasphemy laws or not? Depending on what Islam says, Pakistan should not have blasphemy laws, regardless of what Islam says. Pakistan should be a secular country, regardless of what Islam says. Of course, all religions have had a violent history. Professor Hoodbhoy mentioned about Europe a few centuries ago. Of course, much different times you had violence, but today there is only one religion that codifies death for blasphemy. That is a fact. Now you need to challenge these facts. Now, of course, you need discourse which says that there is a peaceful version of Islam as well, but you can't lead with that. You should lead with the reality that whether or not religion is one way or the other should have no bearing on legislation and statecraft. Is what I would say.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Pervez. Just to finish with you, give us that one thing that will show a change of mindset. 15 seconds.
Equality for all, irrespective of religion, and equality for women.
Equality for all and equality for women. I like that. Barry, can we now come to you, who's been sitting, listening very attentively and stimulated, because I've been watching him. Barry.
Humphrey, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panel, because it has been stimulating. I apologize that sometimes I think it must have been my Wi-Fi froze. I was thinking it was yours that froze, but I think sometimes mine actually froze. And also I had to go out for about a quarter of an hour for a vote. So I'm very much enjoying what Professor Cesari said, but I missed a quarter of an hour of it, I'm afraid. Look, let's just do a quick recap and then try and draw a few things together. Charles spoke of Islam failing to provide the glue to hold the Pakistan state together, and he quoted the saying, if a Muslim majority state can remain part of India, then the rationale for Pakistan evaporates. I think really points that recurred very much in our discussion about legitimacy. Dr. Hoodbhoy spoke about separating out, a very important point about separating out Islamophobia and Muslim phobia. And he also made the point again, which I think is really important in our thinking here, about Islam is held to be perfect. Individual Muslims, of course, are human and are not held to be perfect. So that is very important when we begin to think about how religion is used and how religion is instrumentalized. And he talked about legitimacy in Pakistan being based on religion. I wasn't quite sure that I agreed with his elevation to Pakistan being unique in this way. I was thinking of countries like Iran and so on. I think it is also part of the legitimacy in other countries, but it was certainly a fair point in respect of Pakistan. And of course, he raised the disappearances and the killings by Daesh that had not been condemned by Imran Khan, and pointed that Ahmadis and Hindus had no protection. And the unprecedented tension in Pakistan today, which was even splitting the army. And I think that's very significant, because I can't remember whether it's Dr. Hoodbhoy or somebody else who spoke about Pakistan being controlled by religion. I thought, well, the army, I think, has a fair deal to do with it too. Kunwar Khuldune Shahid spoke of more interested to protect religion from critique than protect Muslims from persecution. This whole business of what is Islamophobia doing. I do wonder whether Islamophobia is the best word when we're talking about sectarian disputes within Pakistan between Shia and Sunni or the Ahmadi Muslims. And you see, if going back to what Dr. Hoodbhoy said about Islam being perfect, if our interpretation is true, then actually we're not being phobic against the other sects. They're just wrong because our interpretation is perfect. And so they're real philosophical and semantic problems that we run up against here. Liberal narrative says the prejudice against Muslims is wrong. And Kunwar then said, why does the Pakistan reality allow the blasphemy laws to be punishable, offending the blasphemy laws to be punishable by death? He said it's rational to be afraid. He talked about the violence that was perpetrated in the name of Islam. Again, I think that the response from somebody who believes that the religion is perfect is that the victims were perpetrating the wrong version of Islam. So you can be imprisoned for reading the Quran. We end up talking about Charlie Hebdo in France, but not talking about the persecution of Muslims in China and the treatment of the Uyghurs, which, of course, in human terms, a far greater crime. He also spoke about not a single Hindu temple being built in Pakistan in the history of the state. Now, I was really enjoying Professor Cesari's discourse. She started, of course, with that quote from Jinnah again about Hindus ceasing to be Hindu, Muslims ceasing to be Muslim, not in a religious sense, because that's their personal faith, but in the sense of each political sense of being a citizen of the state. And then she spoke about her term hegemonic Islam, and the nationalization of Islamic institutions, the Islamicization of the law, and of the national narrative. And spoke about how the state brought clerics and endowments under the control of the state, and religious authorities becoming civil servants. I thought these were really important points, and I was wanting to see how she developed them before the bell went, and I had to rush out for a vote in Parliament. So my apologies for missing the rest of that, but I'd love to catch up on that bit on YouTube and find out exactly what you did say, Professor Cesari. So when Farid Ahmad spoke, he used a powerful metaphor. You can't be a vegetarian and eat beef burgers for lunch, he said. The question, do we claim to be victims of a phobia and condemn hatred and discrimination against ourselves as a means of calling for tolerance of our own hatreds? It seems to me that was the fundamental question that he was addressing here. And maybe not just addressing, but actually accusing Imran Khan and others of using Islamophobia as a means of saying, we are the oppressed, and therefore you cannot criticize us. He spoke powerfully about the need for us to regard each other as part of one humanity. And I was caught by the remark of Dr. Hoodbhoy when he said, going back 3 centuries. Well, actually, going back to 1558, when Queen Elizabeth I in this country proclaimed on her accession to the throne that she had no desire to create a window into men's souls. And that was a very important point in the inflection point in the transition from Catholicism to a more tolerant view in this country. It didn't last terribly long, I have to say, and she had already imprisoned a few bishops at that stage, Catholic bishops at that stage. But it goes back to the first issue of how do we separate out the personal and the institutional, and how can we actually live together? And is that different from how we form a nation state? This distinction between the private and public lives is something that philosophers have grappled with for a very long time. And I think back to that foundational work in 20th century philosophy by John Rawls, A Theory of Justice. And later on in A Theory of Justice, he talks about the role of self-worth and how one attains self-worth by engagement in the public institutions of society. The trouble is that if in those public institutions you do not find a mirror image of yourself, but you find people who disagree, particularly if they disagree with what is your absolute truth, what is your perfection, then actually instead of that being the gel that Lord Bruce spoke of holding society together, it actually becomes a magnetic repulsion force that propels you out from the common public endeavor, the common public space in society, and fragments that society further. So it seems to me that at the heart of this is the problem of pluralism, which is certainly, it was rife in Europe throughout the wars of religion. I thought it was perceptive, I can't remember who said it, but one of our panelists spoke about the USA today, finding that same tension. That tension exists in fundamentalist communities, Christian fundamentalist communities within the United States today. And here, I think in Pakistan, we see that tension really come to a head in that it has not been able to find a way of allowing society to both sign up to an absolute ultimate truth and yet be tolerant of others who don't share it. So it's a question that will continue. It's not something that we answer in an afternoon. It's not something that I think decent individual Pakistanis will be able to address the problem of religious intolerance by. It's a much, much bigger question that goes to the heart of how we form society and how the nation state operates, because the nation state is seeking to bring together people with very different views of what ultimate truth, what the fundamental motivating force of their own lives happens to be.
Harry, thank you very much for summing that up so well. We've got 30 seconds, so could I just ask you a quick question? Jocelyne Cesari gave us a great legislative trajectory of Pakistan's movement towards where it is now. Is there anything, you've been in government, you know how these things work, is there anything anybody, the West or anybody could have done to have stopped that, or would that have happened anyway?
Oh, good Lord. The immediate focus, I think, would have to be on the arms trade and the way in which we have shamelessly used countries like Pakistan as proxies in larger conflicts with the West and Russia in its time. I think the way in which we have fueled that and as I say, used these people as proxies has not helped, and it's enabled certainly that sense of Islamophobia
and terrorism to be united in people's minds.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the panel, Pervez Hoodbhoy, Kunwar, Khuldune, Shahid, Jocelyne, Cesari, and Farid Ahmed for giving us your insight and your argument. Thank you, Barry Gardiner, for summing up so well for us, and Lord Charles Bruce, for both of you for so skillfully bookending our debate. Please join us next month, Wednesday, June the 25th, for our next Democracy Forum debate, Impending Himalayan Water Crisis, Causes and Effects. I very much hope to see you then. Send in your questions and comments in advance, as today. And please stay involved, stay curious, stay safe, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.